Dean here, just wanting to put up my first video for y'all. Every week, I'm going to be trying to do some sort of video interaction. Typically, it might be a little miniature lecture, but this week, because we're mostly doing still some sort of like foundational, introductory sort of information with the course. I don't really have too terribly much that I feel like I want to lecture on. I think right now it's just important that y'all are exploring the topic and understanding the differences between cognitive and non-cognitive development factors, which you'll be getting from your readings. But I did want to kind of go through the course a little bit to try and acclimate you to what every week might be like. I do want to talk about a couple of the readings really quickly, go through the syllabus, some things like that. But for now, I just want to share my screen and show you a little bit of the class itself and what things are kind of going to look like. So you're already pretty familiar with the Blackboard site. I almost called it Canvas, which is what we use at Texas State. Still trying to get used to Blackboard. So if anything is ever broken or doesn't make sense, let me know because it's probably my fault. Um, but you do have this welcome course information tab, which is going to have the syllabus, information about me, the AI statement, um, and then every week you will have, like you did last week, your own tab that's going to have a welcome and then whatever tasks that you're going to do. So for week two, this is kind of what every week is going to look like. I haven't posted it yet, which is why it's still hidden from students. Um, but you will have some sort of welcome message. I feel like it's really important for me to kind of um, give you direction on why I felt it was important to include some stuff in the syllabi. So, what you'll see in a typical welcome is like, hey, here's the kind of task that we have this week. Here's why we're kind of doing these things. What stuff I'm really wanting you to pay attention to and why. Um, I think it's just, for anyone who's teaching any course, I think it's important that we clue in students on why we're doing things a certain way. I think it helps with the learning process and certainly helps, you understand sort of the ways that I'm thinking so that you can push back on that or align with it or whatever you're feeling, ask questions about it. Always feel free to question like any of these decisions, right? It's what we should be doing in education, and this is also a doctoral course. So you're also researchers, you're also professionals, just like I am. So we should be comfortable pushing back on one another and giving our reasonings all the time. And certainly, I'm not exempt from that. So every week we're going to have a welcome. We're going to have a folder with all of your readings. Um, there will typically be quite a few readings. There's still one that I need to add to this. It's, been tricky because I've been having to edit it. Um, but every week we're going to have quite a few readings, and then we're going to have maybe some supplementary things that I'm going to add, and then we'll have the discussion. So the main things for every week will be keeping up with your readings and then engaging in the discussion. And then whenever I post a mini lecture or a video or anything of myself talking about the course content or doing some kind of video, I'll be posting that as well in a separate tab. And then you can feel free to engage with it and ask me questions there about any of the content. So, but the things as far as like what's being graded, what's being assessed, is definitely always going to be the discussion postings and your engagements with each other, as well as keeping up with the readings. And that's going to be sort of the vibe for the majority of the class, especially in this first half of the class. And so if we go to the syllabus, I want to point out a couple of things. Um, One main thing is I know your final is very far away, but one of the things I encourage you to take notes on and to pay attention to as we do our readings every week, especially as we're getting into things in week 3 and 4, where we're talking about the application of some of these non cognitive characteristics. Your final paper, you're going to be picking a non-cognitive characteristic, or if you want to pick a couple of them, that's fine. But you're going to be targeting a non-cognitive characteristic. You're going to be relaying some information about the research on that characteristic and how it's impacted students, or even the characteristic itself as a course outcome or student outcome for a type of research. And then you're going to be creating a lesson plan or an intervention to help students foster these characteristics. Now, this is extremely, extremely, extremely important to contextualize everything that we're doing in this course with what we could be doing in our practice. So, for example, you know, you'll see this Excel spreadsheet. Usually, guess this is a little preview of you for you of it. But when we look at like non-cognitive characteristics, things that students are dealing with, maybe anxiety or issues with their attitudes or belief. Sometimes that has something to do with self efficacy. Sometimes it has to do with their motivations for taking a course or for engaging in a course. Things like goal setting and even their ability to manage their own concentration, self-reflection, self-monitoring. We're going to be talking about so many of these non-cognitive skills, and really and truly, what's the point of doing that if we aren't also thinking about how we can manipulate these things in our classrooms, in our tutoring sessions, in our coaching sessions, how we can help our peer tutors relay some of these concepts and help foster these concepts in students. We're going to be talking about metacognition a lot this semester, especially when we get to self regulation theory later on. And hopefully by then, a chapter in a textbook that I wrote with Sandra McGuire and some other colleagues from LSU, we talk about peer tutoring centers and the things that peer tutors can do in order to foster metacognition skills in the students that come to them for tutoring. And that is, not only a huge responsibility for us who may be supervising a peer tutoring center, um, but also adds to the responsibility that our peer tutors have. But we talk about the ways in which you can do it to where, the students are kind of subtly doing it. They don't have to be experts in metacognition. You can give them prompts. You can give them questionnaires to ask, things that are very formulaic in their tutoring sessions that can make sure they're targeting metacognition in a way that's accessible for them and the person that they're tutoring. And so, if we talk about metacognition being a, impactful non cognitive measure, great, we can talk about that all day, but what the hell does that have to do with student success if we aren't thinking about ways to implement it in our daily practices? So, part of the course is looking at these non cognitive student factors. And the other part of it is okay, we know what these are. We've seen the research showing why they're very important. But now, what do I do as an instructor, as a coach, as a peer mentor? What do I do as a professional to help grow this? And that's going to be what your final exam is getting toward. It's also why it's the final exam, because I want you to have as much information from this course as possible before having to tackle it. But these are things that we can be discussing in our discussion posts. These are things that you can be talking about with your classmates. These are things that you can be taking notes on as you're doing readings and say, hey, I like this intervention that they're talking about that they did in their developmental English course. I wonder if I could do that in my writing center that I run, or I could do it in my tutoring center, or oh, I run professional development for faculty, so maybe I can teach faculty how to do this intervention that research has shown is very important. So I want you to take special note of all those kinds of things and try and relate this content as much as possible every single week to what you are doing in your everyday lives. And if you take a look, the syllabus every week is going to have our readings and gonna have sort of like our main topics. So this week you're gonna have some pretty standard research articles. I think maybe you hopefully have gotten used to reading these types of things in your other courses. If you haven't, perfect. I love teaching methodology. I do methodology with my undergraduate students. I do workshops and courses on how to read research articles. So if you ever have any questions about understanding like analyses or the format of these articles, or just don't understand what they're getting at or why it's important, those are things to comment on my mini lectures and say like, "Hey, I didn't understand this one reading. I know you talked about it. It still makes absolutely no sense to me. Can you break this down more?" Right? And so myself and your classmates can engage with those comments and we can all build this collective knowledge together. And so some of the things you're going to be reading this week is about the model of strategic learning by Claire Ellen Weinstein. This is a seminal piece of theory that is used in the field of developmental education, especially when it comes to behavioral change and student progress. This is something that's foundational for learning frameworks courses, for some university seminar courses. Um, this was born out of cognitive behavioral theory. It's a big deal. I can't undersell it. This is going to be one of the things that is most important for us to understand going through this semester. So this isn't where she first announces the theory, but the thing that I like about this reading is that they talk about cognitive and non-cognitive factors itself, and then go into the model of strategic learning later. So it kind of fulfills both purposes that I have for the course. Um, these two readings here are very important because, they're looking at institutional data and they are looking at, in particular, with the Molnar paper, large scale longitudinal data. One of the things that we fail at the most as educators, whether it's because we don't have time or we don't have the resources or we don't have the institutional support or the training. We are terrible at doing longitudinal studies. We just are. Not that we start to do them and we don't know how, it is we just can't find the time to do it. It's never on our radar. And unfortunately, that means a lot of the research that we're able to do, we're only taking snapshots of a particular moment or a particular intervention, and we aren't able to see what the sort of ripple effects, the repercussions of those interventions are. I mean, if you think about the initial research coming out of co-requisite coursework, a lot of it was like, hey, we put them in co-rec and they were able to complete their first college, credential their first semester, which one, I mean, cool, great. That's kind of the point of a co-rec. You put them in a college level course. Of course, they met the measure of being enrolled in a college level course their first semester. But the other part was that for a number of years, we didn't have longitudinal data yet. And so they were saying, hey, it works, hey, it works, hey, it works. And we didn't necessarily know for how long or where the transferable skills were, the drop off was. And we're just now getting to see a decade later These ripple effects, because if you're doing anything longitudinal with graduation rates, it's got to be 4 to 6 years out. Those are the measures that state and federal entities use to track persistence for, say, a 4 year institution, 4 to 6 years. And so this is great because these are looking at persistence rates, which are going to be longitudinal, or at least across semester to semester in Elder's case. But the large scale longitudinal studies really are powerful to show which cognitive and non cognitive predictors there are for academic success. And that can show people like us what factors to really focus on and learn interventions about. My favorite thing that I'm giving you this week is something from what is called the PIOC, the Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies. Um, this is a sort of a federal assessment by the OECD, where they go into different countries and give sort of a census survey on people's literacy rates, their numeracy rates, their problem solving abilities, which is one of their new factors. Um, and they do this all over the world with a bunch of, European and Asian and South American countries, basically any of the countries that are associated with the OECD, United States included. And it's a really robust study that's been going on for several years. At least I believe the first reports were done, or at least the first data was collected in 2012. So it's been going on for a very long time. And, one of my objectives for the course is to not just get you reading research articles or theory or research about different theories or theories being used as a framework to research, but I also want you to get used to reading things like instruction manuals for institutional assessments or assessment instruments for different factors for students. Reading, legal documents and education policy. So all of these things are built off of the research that we do as educators. And so the research that we've done into cognitive and non-cognitive factors based on assessments like the PIOC end up informing us on, hey, on a larger scale, what things do we need to be focusing on as a country? And then we start doing interventions and things on those factors, right? And so this article by the OECD is actually part of their instruction manual for the assessment framework, which I cut down from like 100 something pages down to I think like 15. You're welcome. But really, what you're going to be reading in there is their sort of reasonings for focusing on cognitive and non cognitive factors and how they um, define them. Because one of the things that we'll be focusing on, especially in our discussion board this week, is how do we define cognitive versus non-cognitive factors? And are these definitions important? Do these definitions matter? How do different groups define them in different ways? And even so, that's going to lead into conversations next week about assessment and outcomes, right? So you're going to be reading a lot of very non-traditional things, I think, in this course, which some of you may enjoy, some of you may loathe it. That's totally fine. But I think it's really important to read some of the non-traditional things, especially if you want to become a researcher or you're wanting to use some of these assessment instruments. You really need to understand it, right? And these things are informed by research, they're informed by theory, all of those things that we're going to be learning throughout the semester. So it's kind of a way to show you the culminations of all of this. So I think that's all I have for you for this week. I talked much longer than I really anticipated in talking, so apologies for that. That's probably going to be a common occurrence. Um, my master's degree is in philosophy. We tend to talk far too much. It's a, you know, persistent problem. But anyway, reach out if you have questions. Hope you enjoy the readings. I hope you get a lot from this week and from the course going forward. And we will talk soon in the discussion boards. Thank you.